first circuit I did, I watched my hands moving around the cockpit.
Didn't know how it was working.
I didn't know what they were doing. It's fly-by-wire in an F-16, so you can literally go 1 to 9G like that. Do you give winter fuel payments to our pensioners, or do you have a nuclear deterrent?
That you're never going to use. Sean, we know Iran can't keep its nose out of anything that's going on in the world at the moment that seeks to give it an advantage. It's selling a lot, like 200 missiles to Russia to assist their illegal war on Ukraine. I think there's many issues. There's two big ones. The first one is that will this give America, Blinken, an opportunity to say, me too, permission? The second is that, in my recollection, there were sanctions, maybe they've timed out, against Iran doing this sort of thing. So how is it possible? Is this a breach of something or not? And if not, could we invent one? Maybe we do it in reverse order. So do the sanctions first and then get into how the West, in particular the US, might respond.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, isn't there? Good morning, Burton. I think Iran's been interesting because of its nuclear program. It's been subject to a load of sanctions. UN Security Council over many, many years, 2 decades, it's been piling on sanctions, and most of it's to stop it developing a weaponized nuclear program. And some of the, without going into detail, because it would bore the viewers, but there were a lot of sanctions on its ability to export arms, including ballistic missiles. But those timed out in October of last year. And therefore, it was no great surprise that we saw the Russian president and a couple of his senior leadership going across on visits to Iran. We understand now that a contract was signed in December of last year for a supply of missiles. And we now recently just heard in the last couple of days, Antony Blinken talking about the fact that the 200 of these ballistic missiles have been delivered. Now, face value, is there anything wrong with buying weapons from the open market to help? I mean, Ukraine is buying and being donated weapons. Why wouldn't Russia? I think what's interesting on this particular one is Russia is not able to source its weapons from most of the free world, and therefore it's going to North Korea, which is still the subject of sanctions. So it's breaking the very sanctions that Russia signed up to as a core member of the UN Security Council. But also it's very cynical that it waited till virtually the day that these sanctions timed out and then buys its weapons from Iran. What's I think most interesting about that is that it isn't just a shop. Can we buy some? Here's some money. What Iran is getting in return for this is a lot more than money. It's isolated on the global stage. It wants to develop its nuclear program, and it wants to be a more robust military power in the region. By all accounts, Russia is helping out on every one of those. Hard currency. It's selling it fighter jets, which will dramatically increase Iran's military capability. And if reports are to be believed, it's also helping it with some of its nuclear program. Because bluntly, if it came to a conversation, if you were Iran's president and I'm President Putin, I desperately need your missiles. You desperately need help with your nuclear program. I only want to pay you cash. You go, no, I'd like a bit more than that because I know how hungry and desperate you are, President Putin. So I think what's been happening here is that both sides are getting quite a lot out of this. The danger, of course, is that it risks destabilizing the world because Iran may have timed out those sanctions, but it's still an incredible focus of attention for the international community around these weapons.
So my first question is, how the hell did the West allow sanctions to time out? Okay, most contracts have a lapse clause. Then it requires both parties this mutuality. You don't need mutuality for sanctions. Why did the West let them lapse? Why don't they just reinstate them?
Well, it's a great question, and I think the trouble is the United Nations Security Council has to pass these things pretty unanimously for them to continue. And of course, the world moves on, and I'd be really interested to know Russia behind the scenes whether it would have been prepared to sanction Iran and extend these sanctions. It's all linked to the nuclear program. Maybe that's something we look at in another one of our podcasts because it's quite complicated, but at its heart, is that it takes decades to develop a nuclear weapons program, and it's quite difficult to get all of the enriched uranium that you need to build a weapon. And that's all quite closely guarded. As a result, it is very difficult to do it without anybody knowing about it. And the West will be incredibly worried if Iran, the dark shadow behind a lot of the troubles in the Middle East, was to get a nuclear program. So that has been a key focus of these sanctions. But as you say, they have timed out now, allowing them to now sell these now. And the worry is practically, so going back to your first question.
Before we get on to that, though,
yeah, go on.
Just to pick up the couple of points from there. I mean, there's two lessons here, both of which we've discussed before. The first one is, don't let these sanctions lapse. Now, I'm not a supporter or against Trump, but I know what he'd have said. He said, I don't give a monkeys about the United Nations. I'm sorry. These are the sanctions. Tough luck. But the more interesting one, which we've covered before, is we now know for lots of evidence that every time Putin signs a contract, whatever it is, you can bet your bottom dollar, the very next day he'll just tear it up. We have to find other ways to keep in check on these international bullies.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about the sanctions route, though, and if you look more widely at what Russia's doing at the moment, is it an isolated country that's run rogue and will eventually be dealt with? Or is it the front of house for an alter ego to NATO, to be the front of house for a collection of other countries that don't see the world through the same lens as America does, that wants to challenge that American dominance of democracy is the right answer for the world, English is the right language for the world, and
dollar is the right currency.
The dollar is the right currency, and therefore there's a really interesting conversation going on here. And the trouble is sanctions being placed by an international organization like the United Nations, and America is the most powerful member of that, is that if you were Russia, if you were Iran, or you were one of these, North Korea, you'd see that as a tool that America is using to exert influence around the world. And therefore, you would start to put some grit in the machinery of that, try and stop it working. And I think that's why International Criminal Court has basically put an arrest warrant out for Putin, but he went quite happily off to a country the other week where Mongolia, which is a signatory to so it should have locked him up.
There you go.
Didn't. Yeah. And I think he's basically putting two fingers up to the Western world. So I think the sanction thing is, I agree with you in principle, but what is the global power, the top of shop?
Yes, but that is the question. I agree.
The judge.
And Tim mentioned this. Tim mentioned this last week. So, yeah. Anyway, I interrupted your thing about Blinken and what we think the response will be.
Yeah, because I think the diplomatic language the last couple of days has been really interesting around this.
So I think a hallmark from day one of our efforts to support Ukraine against this aggression is to work to make sure that they have what they need when they need it to be most effective in dealing with the Russian aggression. And I think that you've seen, again, from day one, that we have continuously adjusted and adapted based on battlefield conditions, based on what Russia was doing in a given place and by given means. And that's been a through line in everything that we've done. It's not just the system itself that counts. You have to ask, can the Ukrainians effectively use it? And sometimes that requires significant training, which we've done. Do they have the ability to maintain it? Again, this is something that we've worked on. And then, is it part of an effective strategy?
So President Zelensky has been turning around and saying, I need more weapons. I'm on the back foot in the Donbass. I need more weapons, long-range weapons, and take off the restrictions. And so far, some countries are happy that Ukraine uses the weapons to their full. But in terms of making sure NATO has a coherent conversation here, that's why Blinken and the US has put a little bit of pressure on allies. The language, though, the other day was Blinken was saying, we're working it. In other words, now that Iran is providing missiles to Russia, which are they're ballistic missiles, they're fairly long range, the intimation of the diplomatic language, that was an escalation, we need to match it. And you could tell that he was finding diplomatic language to try to unlock the ability, so it wasn't seen as escalatory by the West to provide long-range weapons that could be used into Russian territory. The language was all about, you've started this, Russia, you invaded Ukraine, you're now buying long-range weapons to target Ukraine. We should allow Ukraine to do the same to you. And it'll be really interesting, I think. Now, Blinken talked about other things in that same conference, not least of which, look, Zelensky, stop bleating. You've got your own weapons. You've got long-range drones that are proving very effective. He also said that there isn't any one weapon that's going to be decisive here. And the third one, interestingly, he talked about this will eventually come to a negotiated solution, and we've got to be careful not to tip the balance either way. But I do think, back to your core of your question, this provision of 200 missiles, as we understand it, ballistic missiles from Iran, I sense is being used by diplomatic language to unlock potentially more support and less restrictions for Zelensky.
Yes. And as you implied, we know, well, we assumed last week that what Zelensky had done by invading mainland Russia was to give himself a couple of aces for a future negotiation. In diplomatic or political terms, Blinken's innuendos and statements recently could equally be a message to Putin. Look, when the time comes to negotiate, don't forget, we now feel we've got permission to go a lot further, and you probably wouldn't like that.
I think there's a lot you can read into this. The trouble is, I'm an ex-military guy, so I look at this far more through the military lens. You only negotiate when you've achieved what you want to achieve. One side wins and one side loses, or when you're in a stalemate. Now, what does winning look like for Ukraine? Looks difficult to achieve that. What does winning look like for Russia? We don't know. It looks like that Russia could achieve its objectives by actually taking the rest of the Donbass. Russia might do that in the coming weeks. And if it does, it could sell that domestically as success. Therefore, any negotiation, what would the rest of the world do? At the moment, front of house, it would say it's up to President Zelensky. By taking some land in Russia, does he buy himself more negotiating room? As a military guy, I'm not sure. I think that would be very difficult for President Putin to swallow. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Putin, once he's achieved his objectives in the Donbass, will secure that line and then move his troops around and deal with that incursion around the Kursk region. And once he's done that, then he'd be ready to negotiate.
I think the map makers have already got the ink wet on redrawing the world map, don't you?
My heart sinks a bit though whenever and I'm really torn, genuinely torn about this, because there's part of me that knows that wars can't go on forever, that, you know, eventually you've got to move on and rebuild. I saw a figure the other day about, you know, $500 billion worth of rebuilding costs in Ukraine, quite apart from the devastation, the lives lost, etc. How do you rebuild and recover? A dreadful thing, and then get yourself back on the front foot. That process can't start until the war's over. But if you stop the war today, if you negotiate a solution and reward President Putin, I genuinely worry where that leaves us in terms of global security. And my worry is, and we've talked a bit about it before, is that, you know, some of our political leaders are driven by short-term success, and therefore claiming that they brought peace on the world by negotiating with President Putin and calling an end to the war might make them look popular in the near term. But I worry that history books will record how that was folly.
Sure, we welcome all the comments that we get from our followers and viewers. And one individual a couple of weeks ago said about the war in Ukraine, we're now providing planes. Finding pilots who've got the skills is a bit harder. So he suggested, what about effectively called mercenary pilots, former pilots that maybe can be minimally retrained, available on the open market potentially if they're interested, why don't we use that as a source of, that sort of competence?
Yeah, it was an interesting debate. Thank you. And we're always welcome, as we've always said, comments in, and we'll try and take them up. As a former fighter pilot myself, I think it throws up a whole load of issues. Headline is that the West has said that although President Zelensky reckons he needs well over 100 jets in order to mount a credible combat air capability in Ukraine, the West has so far, I think, promised around 85 F-16s, and with a view to potentially having a few more downstream. That sounds pretty close. The problem is, as you said, it's not just about the jets, it's the weapons, it's the engineers, it's everything else. Now, the one thing that you can't do without is the pilot. The pilot takes a long time to train, and although there are training courses going on in the UK as we speak, and they're converting people to F-16s, you can't just put them in an F-16 and send them to war. And the total number of pilots that Ukraine actually has at the moment that are trained to fly the F-16, I understand, is very small and potentially could be single digits. They've also, just a couple of weeks ago, tragically, one was shot down. Sounds like friendly fire, sounds like a Patriot system. So they've now got one less. That's a big hit. So, of course, inevitably the question comes out, well, okay, you've got the equipment. Surely you should be able to get pilots from around the world who've flown F-16s, now are airline pilots or whatever, and join. The whole issue of getting Western folk involved, the US has been very clear. They've banned any of their military guys or their reservists, because when you leave the military, that from engaging in the war, because they absolutely, presentationally, are paranoid. It's one thing providing weapons. It's quite another putting combatants on the ground. And therefore, they don't want any risk of that happening. But let's park that for now. Would a pilot who's been out of the cockpit for 5 years,
or much longer, like you,
how quickly would you be able to? Would it take years, or would it be like riding a bike?
But what would it be? I mean, you were a combat air fighter pilot in the most modern plane at the time. What do you reckon? If somebody came to you and you were willing to do it, what would the journey be from now to getting in an F-16 and flying it?
Yeah, well, in a way, you do that when you're in your career, because I stepped out of flying duties. As you get more senior, you spend more and more time sat at a desk and less time in a cockpit.
Is that flying a desk?
Yeah, flying a desk. And I think the longest gap I had was about 5 years. And you go back to the operational conversion unit to relearn how to fly the jet after 5 years away. And when you arrive and the first time you jump in the aircraft, it's instantly familiar, and it's a bit surreal because, for example, when you're flying in the circuit, so you get airborne, fly downwind, and then land, you do that regularly to learn how to land again. Downwind, before you land, there's a whole series of checks you have to do. Your hands are moving around the cockpit. First circuit I did, I watched my hands moving around the cockpit.
Didn't know how it was working.
I didn't know what they were doing, but they knew what they were doing because they were automatically reaching for. And when I was, the Harrier was particularly difficult because you were taking away, there was some aerodynamics, but also some raw power. And how you balance that is a real trick. My hands went straight back into doing it. It was a skill that once you've learnt it, you don't forget. Things like air combat. I thought, have you forgotten everything? No, it's all still there. You're rusty.
So that was in a Harrier, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So, difficult question, but to answer our viewers' contribution, if you can, take yourself now. Okay, you may not be the ideal, not too many grey hairs.
It's hair envy. I've told you about that before.
But take yourself. You're going to fly an F-16 in a war in Ukraine. What would you think it would take, time-wise, with some of the content to get you?
So, if I was the head of the Ukrainian Air Force, I wouldn't be targeting people with anything other than F-16 experience. So, the fact that I've flown a military fast jet, I could put a pilot in an F-16, up, down, left, right, faster, slower. That works in virtually any aeroplane.
In a combat situation.
Combat situation, where the switches are, how you deal, the situational awareness, how you blend mentally, all this stuff going on.
Yeah.
Going back into a jet that I had been good at, I was just rusty. All the motor skills were still there. It was just a question of getting rid of the rust.
So how long now? So let's say it's a Harrier.
Back to a Harrier, probably 6 months.
6 months. That's a long time.
It is, but if it was wartime, you'd have that, that was 6 months at a fairly relaxed rate.
Okay.
You could probably do it in a matter of 10 to 12 weeks at an intense rate, not allowing, but the core here is you need to have flown the F-16 before, ideally flown the model, the mark of F-16 with a particular set of kit that they're operating, because as soon as the pilot sat in it, he'd get that same sense of deja vu. He'd already know how to do the stuff, and he was on a really intensive. Now, the things he'd be rusty at would be something they'd have to be careful of, but also you would have a whole mass of experience which would still be there that you could capitalize upon. So it wouldn't be a question of just jumping in the jet, unfortunately, but it would be it wouldn't be a couple of years to get them sorted. It would depend on how. I'm not sure the Ukrainians have got a 2-seat F-16, in other words, a trainer, and I'm also not sure whether the Ukrainians have got a comprehensive simulator program available, because the simulators these days are so good that you can do most of your training in that. And where we used to do a simulator every other day, you could actually do 2 or 3 a day and work 7 days a week. You could very quickly get people back up to speed.
So, bottom line is, you think it's feasible?
Yes.
Sounds like you'd have to be sort of recently retired from it, to combat the sort of fade and the grey cells, the grey matter sort of deteriorating.
Yeah.
But all of those considered, maybe, in a wartime situation where you can do intensive training, bearing in mind you've got to take a plane up on your own, 3 months.
Yeah, I think that's probably feasible. Again, there's lots of variables in there, but the huge benefit would be that you've got somebody in the cockpit who's used to using some of the technology that the West uses, like Link 16, which effectively helps you build an air picture, which it takes a long time during your training and your early days of experience to work out how you sift through this hose pipe of information to distill out the droplets that you need. But it's interesting, once you've learned to do that, it isn't a skill you easily forget. Whereas for the Ukrainian pilots, they've got to start from scratch with some of that, somebody coming back in. So there's a balance between, yes, a veteran pilot would be rusty, but he starts from a point where he knows how all this stuff works. He knows how to build situational awareness. He knows his own limitations. And things like a 9G aircraft, it's quite brutal on the body, and particularly because it's fly-by-wire in an F-16, so you can literally go 1 to 9G like that. You need to be ready for that, because if you're not ready for it, you're out like a light. And it's quite draining physically. But all of that is a physical training program, mental training program. So I think it's only a matter of months to get people in. And bear in mind, it's not, although the US has said no, the F-16 is the most widely sold fighter jet in the world. There are lots of countries out there that have very capable F-16 pilots who are available in the wings.
John, that's the longest yes answer I've ever heard. But we'll take it. Okay, Sean, so they got the planes. If they can get pilots to match, so they can go from what's been offered 80 odd up to what he wants, 100. Does this also open the door to creating a no-fly zone, at least in the west of Ukraine?
The start of the war, all right, as a former military pilot, I'm absolutely convinced if the West was to put a no-fly zone over Ukraine, Russia would be stopped in a heartbeat. Russia has struggled to have air superiority over Ukraine when Ukraine has not got the kit or equipment to match it. If you put the West involved, it would stop Russia in a heartbeat. But for all sorts of reasons, that put combatants into the area. NATO's not prepared to do that. So it was taken off the table. First of all, what are you going to use these F-16 pilots for? There's not many of them, and you don't want them put them too near the front line. So one of the ways of doing it is to help them, get them to shoot down cruise missiles and shoot down drones. Remember when Iran launched that massive wave of attack against Israel back in April, I think it was. The West put up loads of fighter jets and shot down most of these cruise missiles and drones. So undoubtedly, that's one of the ways that Zelensky will be using those F-16s. But now that with Ukraine on the back foot somewhat, it's been raised again that given that Western air power is sitting off the side of Ukraine at the moment as the eyes and the ears over, why doesn't it step over the line and actually only provide a no-fly zone over, for example, the west of Ukraine to help the F-16s and also to help shoot down missiles? Very limited risk of actually killing any Russian pilots, very limited risk of anything going into Russian airspace, not going to get targeted, so it's very unlikely. But you could be quite effective at protecting Ukrainian cities in the western half of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think there's quite a compelling argument for this, if I'm to be blunt. It does put Western folks into Ukraine, but it does ensure that the normal no-fly zone idea, which was the whole of Ukraine, so you're the Russian on the Russian side of the border, you fire a missile at me, my missile is going to take you out, and therefore I kill you on Russian soil. That is an escalation by the West. If I'm not actually at the front line, if I'm actually hundreds of miles back, but providing a protective shield over parts of Ukraine,
it's different.
It feels different. Now, I know if you go to the binary, it is committing combatants to the war. Politicians aren't prepared to do that. But if you scrap a little bit below the surface, I think it minimizes the risk of actually those combatants being involved against Russia, and all they're doing is helping protect Ukrainians. Be really interesting to see if that's the next thing on the table.
Sean, UK has a National Audit Office, the NAO. It does value for money assessments, sort of midway or towards the end of any sort of government spending program. It's now getting into the Ukraine war. What have we spent? What have we got from it? What's the values? Very difficult to try and make economic or even moral arguments. Why are they deciding to do it, apart from the obvious? And where because this will open up a number of other questions, which might be actually quite uncomfortable. How do you see it going?
The report by the NAO was embargoed until the early hours this morning. So as we record, it's on the Wednesday. Having looked through it, it's really interesting as an overview of our nation's financial commitment to the war. And I think the headline figures were, I think it was nearly £8 billion spent, over 3,000 deliveries of military aid to Ukraine since the start of the war, 230 MOD staff that are directly involved in the MOD, and over 42,000 Ukrainian soldiers trained in the UK under Op Interflex. And it really was just going through the numbers and what we've done. I think when you actually look at it rather more deeply as somebody who's slightly inside the tent, a couple of things that caught my eye, one of which is that because these 42,000 Ukrainians are going through a training system in the UK, they're getting at least 5 weeks training. That's at the hands of UK Army instructors using UK Army ranges and UK Army equipment. We don't have enough to do the Ukrainians
and ours.
And the report says that this is having the British Army particularly is paying a price for this in terms of its operational capability. And one of the stats they say is that some of the training ranges, when the British Army tries to book that range to do some of its own training, sometimes those requests are declined because there's somebody else using the range or it's being repaired or whatever. The level at which they're declined has gone up by nearly 10 times. So in other words, there's 10 times the refusals for going out and doing those live training exercises.
Because of it being used.
Because it's being used by the Ukrainian training setup.
Right. And what about the maintenance issues? Presumably these ranges and their equipment and the processing, the reporting after the event, which, the military in the UK are very keen on doing, maybe that's suffering as well.
I've no doubt that behind those figures, there's a lot more to it. I think, though, the headlines are that the UK, the British military, are renowned globally for the quality of their operational training. We have got lots of people serving who've got experience from Iraq, from Afghanistan. It's not learning it from a book. They've actually been out there and done it for real. They've lost colleagues. They've had to deal with first aid, brutal injuries. They've come under fire. They've learned how to react, and therefore it's ingrained in them, and they're very good at training. But that training traditionally is part of that recycling where you train the next generation of British Army to be ready and capable. It's pretty evident from the numbers here that is falling behind quite significantly at the moment. The other issue is about the money, because it talked about 7.8 billion has been spent. Can we unpick one element of that? So they talked about, I think it was 2.7 billion had been spent on equipment. In other words, weapons for Ukraine. How's that made up? Now, if we ended up using a lot of our stockpiles, existing weapons that we gave to Ukraine. Now, those weapons, some of them, like Storm Shadow, were nearly 30 years old. So is the price that we put against that contribution what we paid for that missile at the start, or what its stock value is today because it's at the end of its life? Storm Shadow is a really good example because we were going to upgrade out. We only bought 1,000. About 200 have been used in operations. About 300 are going to be upgraded. That left about 500, 600. Didn't know what to do with them. So either you pay industry to decommission them, or you pay industry to store them. So it's a cost to us.
So it's a negative cost.
Correct. Whereas if you give them to Ukraine, you've saved yourself that money. But the way the accounting is being done is, rather than this stock value, which is, I think in this particular case, the stock value of the weapons that we've given to Ukraine is about 170 million. But the cost we've attributed to our support to Ukraine is 2.7 billion.
So what this government ought to be saying is, for this element of it, and I'm sure it will apply to the other bits as well, they could say, so far, we've saved the UK economy $2.5 billion.
Yeah, because we were going to have to...
I bet the numbers.
Yeah, but we were going to have to upgrade these weapons anyway. So I think there's a little bit of artistic license going on here. Because yes, if you hand weapons over, it leaves you a shortfall in your stockpile. You've got to restock. You can't go into a supermarket today and buy a Storm Shadow missile. The technology is 30 years old. And I would never recommend that we commission the same company that built it to go back 30 years ago and take the ancient technology that was involved then and rebuild those missiles. If you're going to replace it, you're going to upgrade it. It just makes sense. But that upgrade costs you more money. You're going to have to pay for that anyway. So what level do you attribute against our contribution? And I think, don't get me wrong, I understand the political imperative to demonstrate that we are supporting Ukraine and the numbers. Rightly, you have to replace your stock, and therefore the cost of that replacement is what we're effectively attributing.
Yeah. Well, my cynical view of politicians. So I think there's two answers to your last question. The first is the politicians will decide based on the politics what is the right number, so they look good. And the second number, I've forgotten.
No, but I think that you're absolutely right. And part of me knows, and that's where Storm Shadow, I think, is a really good example, because just imagine people saying, they need weapons. We've got a lot of weapons here that are going to cost us money. let's give them to Ukraine. A really good thing to do. They undoubtedly proved very, very effective. The challenge is what cost you attribute against that. And I'm not entirely sure that it's reasonable to say 30 years ago, we spent £2 million a missile on Storm Shadow. We've given you, let's say, 200. So it's now 400 million we've attributed. Nah, I'm not sure that's quite right.
Yeah. Well, at the moment, we like to say that we've given Ukraine a lot of money. One question is it actually a gift or is it a loan that therefore has to be repaid?
Yeah, well, I think there's two answers to that. One of which is that Ukraine used to have former Soviet Union kit and not very much of it. At the end of this war, are they A, going to go back to their Soviet Union store and replenish, or are they B, going to look to the West and buy stuff from the West? So if you were a salesman from the West, you'd be seeing this as a growth opportunity because the Ukrainians are likely to buy Western weapons in the future because they've used them and they've seen just how effective they are. I'm not sure we can read too much into that at the moment. I do think, though, that the weapons question, what's fascinating from my perspective is that the West still does not want to give Ukraine its state-of-the-art weapons because some of them will fall into the hands of the Russians. By all accounts, the Russians have handed some of the drone technology to the Iranians.
They can reverse engineer them.
Reverse engineer, and suddenly the very technology that is part of our asymmetric advantage gets handed over.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be an interesting conversation about what you can give. And unfortunately, that means it tends to be older kit, which even though it's very good, we're less worried about the technology falling into the Russians' hands. The challenge for us then is how do you replace it? And that often takes time.
Sure. Do we have a problem with this or not? So we intimated a couple of weeks ago that with the Labour government win at the election, defence being a major aspect, very hard to get votes, but it's quite a big issue at the moment. They had to say things before and indeed after. They appear to be committed. They, however, are spending a lot of money. I mean, on other things. They're spending 11, 12 billion on what I call climate reparations with other countries throughout the world. Are they going to have enough money left to actually deliver on the defence commitments they've made? Secondly, they are struggling a bit with ideology, as recent votes, which we won't go into, in the House has shown. There's a deep ideology against military action spending, which they're going to have to overcome. And so therefore the question is, have they really kicked the can down the road with this strategic defence review? Have they put it beyond them having to actually do something about it? And I think we learned from Greg Bagwell also, when we interviewed him, that it's not a full SDR in a sense. It doesn't end with, we're going to do this, 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 and this, and this, and it's going to cost us this much money. There'll be another review that follows. If I'm sitting here in your shoes, I'm thinking, this doesn't sound great.
No, and I concur. With a different hat on, I am involved in discussions around helping inform this next defence review. And it's really interesting hearing some of the rumourings, the mumblings around this, because obviously there's lots of people committing papers, but there's also some fairly senior level engagement. And it would not be betraying confidences to say that there is a growing view that you mentioned defence commitments. It's not entirely clear what those are. And there is a view that says, rather than actually in the near term going up to 2.5%, which the data I've seen simply actually keeps us standing still in terms of military capability.
Okay.
But actually, it's worse than that. It looks likely that that's not where the government will go, because the choices they're prepared to make, that if you put more money in defence, you have to take it out of something else, or you have to dramatically increase taxes. And we're speculating because we don't know until the review's done, the government makes the decision. But it is starting to feel like, yes, we'll do a defence review. It feels like a more dangerous world, but come up with some ideas. Time clicks on closer and closer to the 5-year point when there's another general election. And if you hit that general election and you haven't spent money on defence, but you have spent money elsewhere, defence is never a vote winner, and you're just gambling that we won't regret not paying our insurance premiums during that 5-year period.
Yeah.
Now, again, I reiterate, this is speculation because until the government actually does something, but there's all the ingredients at the moment for a kick the can down the road moment. And my real worry is that the people have generated this 2.5% number. I was with a company that specializes is looking at the costs of defense. And the trouble is defense inflation is pretty significant. Technology constantly goes up faster than just your price of your bread and peas. And therefore, if you kept what you had today, by the end of this decade, you'd have to spend 2.5% otherwise just to stand still.
Yeah.
In other words, if you don't spend 2.5%, your defense capability shrinks. And that feels counterintuitive at the moment.
It's a shame, really, because in my tech world, innovation makes things cheaper, not more expensive. So there's a lot of money in this game. There's another factor here for me. This is called the Strategic Defence Review, the SDR. There's also something with 4 letters called the SDSR, the Strategic Defence and Security Review. Now, the third letter, the S, has been taken out. Security is a major issue. It's also completely woven in to defence as a whole. The digital world is going at rampant speed. I think what's going to happen is when we get to the end of this, somebody's going to put that and say, now we need to do the third S, third letter. And so there's another period of time when the security is wrapped in, which inevitably unravels some of the previous stuff that's been done, because maybe ES means the other stuff doesn't have to be done to the same extent. Maybe you need to do more because they need to be coherent together. What do you think?
I'm a bit schizophrenic on this one because having lived through the period where we went from strategic defence reviews to strategic defence and security reviews, there is a compelling logic about tying those together. The problem is that the bigger you make these reviews, the more things it has to cover, the more difficult it is to actually come up with concrete proposals, and it becomes, all things to all men. It doesn't actually tackle any of the issues. One of the beauties about having a defence review is it's about warfighting. It's about making sure our military arms, both in air and space and land and navy, are ready to fight our nation's enemies and to look after our interests around the world. Security covers so many more things, and you're into cyber, you're into all sorts of other areas. And I wouldn't want to underplay those, but it's a much bigger gorilla you've got to tackle. And therefore, in a way, you could argue that if they'd started with a strategic defence and security review, that's such a big undertaking that with only a limited amount of time, you're only actually going to be achieved so much. If you just focus on defence, you could potentially focus on a lot more. The trouble is, I tend to look at these things from a relatively simplistic view. At the moment, are we going to have a nuclear deterrent? Why do I ask that question? Because it's ferociously expensive. It takes a significant proportion of the defence budget. And at the moment, we're facing a 10-year period where we've got to replace our nuclear deterrent, and that is a huge capital spend. Does defence get any more money to cover that? No. Therefore, the rest of the defence budget is smaller than it would normally be for that 10-year period so that you can do that nuclear capability.
That's going to be one of the biggest issues ideologically.
No, I agree. Because if you turn the wick off, you could spend a lot more money on defence from the same budget.
Yeah.
But if you are going to have a strategic deterrence, and I suspect that's not going to change, then how much money do you put in to top it up? In a more dangerous world, we've talked about before, you'd probably have to double the defence budget to actually make a meaningful difference. Do I think there's any chance of that happening in the near term? No, there's not. So I do think the politicians, given this is about choices, it's nothing more than choices.
Favourite word at the moment with our politicians?
Yeah. And already we've seen some pretty interesting choices being made.
I'll tell you something else is going to happen. Jeremy Corbyn is not going away. He's got a massive following. In the 2 elections he lost, he got more votes and more percentage of those eligible to vote than Keir Starmer got when he won and had a massive majority. So Jeremy Corbyn is still a big figure. He's now, looks like he's trying to build, it wouldn't be too far of a stretch of the imagination to call it a new sort of party, but a party within a party. He's going to be a thorn in their side. So when this SDR comes to its conclusion and the issues you've just raised are going to be considered, you can bet your bottom dollar Jeremy Corbyn is going to go around lassoing support for the non-nuclear discussion.
And you can see it now, can't you? You can see it now. You can see him going, we've got a massive overdraft. Do you give winter fuel payments to our pensioners, or do you have a nuclear deterrent?
That you're never going to use.
That you're never going to use. Yeah. And frankly, we're a part of NATO. And that argument, I'm trivializing it, but we can see that's going to be playing out, his choices.
Yeah. Sure, we are going to pick this up on another occasion because this is a big, big, big subject. We now know that Turkey has been a long-term 70 years member of NATO, one of the biggest military nations in NATO, been trying to join the EU for 20 years. It's been disallowed on so many, many different points of arguments. It's fed up pointing its face to the West. It's now turning east. It's had meetings in China. It's going to join BRICS. It's going to be part of this new allegiance of the East against the West and an attempt to change world order from everything from military right down to economics. This honestly does not sound like good news, and it sounds like the beginning of really, really bad news. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we need to explore this properly. Most nations only operate in their national interest. So, and let's be clear, BRICS is not a military organization. It's a commercial. It's to do with making sure that your economy stays vibrant and where your trade options are. But being simplistic about it, once you are engaging commercially with countries like China, inevitably those conversations are not just about tariffs and movement. They're also about exchanging technology. And that's why we're seeing at the moment a lot of countries that don't want to support Russia, but are largely supporting Russia because they're customers of Russian oil, because they have influence. It would be naive to think. I think what must be interesting behind the scenes is I'm pretty sure our political leaders have been trying to get Turkey into the EU to try and avoid this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Face value, Turkey is still a member of NATO. But do I see this as cracks forming in the dam? Absolutely.
Yeah, we must get into it. Sean, you are off to Ukraine. Now, based on what we were discussing a moment ago, because of all that grey hair, you are not going to be flying F-16s anytime soon. So what are you doing over there?
Yeah, I'm really keen to go. We talk about the war. I'm a military guy, 30 years of experience of operations, and I look at it through a ruthlessly militaristic lens. But the moral component of fighting power is probably the most important. The resilience of people, their confidence, their bravery, their tenacity. And I've never been to Ukraine. So I'm going, just going to spend a week there. Got a series of meetings set up, a little bit of work. But my primary thing is that I spent best part of 2 years in Afghanistan. We had lots of amputees as a result of our operations in Afghanistan. Ukraine is having an order of magnitude more of those. They're being dealt with at a facility called Superhumans in Lviv. I'm going to meet some of these brave Ukrainian servicemen, and I'm going to see if I can do a bit of fundraising to try and do a little bit to help. But the main aim is to better understand what's going on the ground. Not going anywhere near the front line, way too old and knackered for that. Yeah. But basically get a better flavour of what's going on and hopefully inform our future chats.
Brilliant. So Red Matrix are raising money for the charity. So how do people log on to it? We'll put it in the comments as well.
Yeah, it's Just Giving site. Anybody that can bring anything to bear will all be welcome. As I say, this is us. We're self-funding a visit out to Ukraine, and we're determined to try and do something to help. We've got the support of a brave ex-para who lost both his legs in Afghanistan. And he is very keen to support. It's not just about the prosthetics. It's actually about the rehabilitation. And what we're trying to do is raise enough money to help 10 Ukrainian soldiers with their rehabilitation. Anything you do to help will be really, really welcome.